Remember the 1990s? Dial-up internet, pagers, and CD players everywhere. Tech companies were racing to create the next big thing. They spent fortunes developing gadgets they swore would change our lives. Spoiler alert, most of them didn't. In fact, some failed so spectacularly that they became legends for all the wrong reasons. We're talking about products that looked amazing on paper, but fell apart the moment real people tried to use them. From Apple's biggest embarrassments to gaming consoles that made kids sick, these failures cost billions and taught the industry some hard lessons. These are the 10 biggest tech flops from the 1990s that failed terribly. If you love tech history and want to see more deep dives like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. The 1990s were a wild time for technology. The internet was just getting started. Cell phones were becoming affordable, and every tech company on the planet was trying to predict what we'd want next. Some got it right, most got it wrong, and a few got it so wrong that their products became legendary failures. These weren't small mistakes. We're talking about products that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to develop. Products that were supposed to revolutionize entire industries. But instead, they ended up as punchlines in business school case studies. So what went wrong? Why did these innovative products fail so miserably? Let's find out. Number 10, the Timex Sinclair 1000. Let's kick things off with one of the cheapest computers ever made, and I mean that in both senses of the word. In 1982, Timex and Sinclair teamed up to bring computing to the masses. Their solution? The Timex Sinclair 1000. This little black box cost less than $100. That's right, under $100 for your very own home computer. At the time, that was revolutionary. Most computers cost thousands. The Commodore 64, which came out the same year, was selling for $595. So a sub $100 computer, that got people's attention. The Timex Sinclair 1000 came with 2 kilobytes of RAM. For comparison, your smartphone probably has about 4 million times more memory than that. It displayed in black and white. And instead of a proper keyboard, it had this weird membrane thing that felt like pressing on a calculator. But hey, it was cheap. And for a while, that was enough. The thing actually sold pretty well at first. People bought them thinking they'd learn to program, or let their kids mess around with technology. Then, reality set in. The computer was painfully slow. Programs took forever to load from cassette tapes. Yes, cassette tapes. The same ones you used to record songs off the radio. And if you wanted to do anything useful, you needed to buy extra memory, which wasn't cheap. The keyboard was a nightmare. That membrane design meant you could never really tell if you'd pressed a key or not. Typing anything longer than a few sentences was torture. And the software? Forget about it. There just wasn't much available. Most useful programs required the 16 kilobyte memory expansion, which defeated the whole purpose of buying a cheap computer in the first place. By the time competitors like the Commodore 64 hit their stride, the Timex Sinclair 1000 looked like a toy, and not even a good toy. It was a frustrating, limited machine that promised the world and delivered a headache. Timex tried releasing an upgraded version, but the damage was done. The brand was associated with cheap, unreliable computers. Sales tanked, and the whole experiment was over by 1984. The lesson? Sometimes you get what you pay for. Number 9. Fisher-Price PXL 2000. Speaking of toys, let's talk about Fisher-Price's attempt to turn kids into filmmakers. In 1987, Fisher-Price released the PXL 2000. This was a toy video camera that recorded onto standard audio cassette tapes. Yeah, you heard that right. Video on audio cassettes. The idea was brilliant. Give kids an affordable way to make their own movies. At $179, It was way cheaper than real camcorders, which cost thousands at the time. But there was a catch. Actually, several catches. First, the video quality was terrible. We're talking grainy black and white footage that looked like security camera footage from a haunted house. You could barely make out what you were filming. Second, you could only record about 5 minutes per cassette. And those cassettes had to be the right type, or the whole thing wouldn't work. Third, and this is the big one, kids didn't really want it. Sure, the idea of making movies sounded cool, but when the results looked that bad, the novelty wore off fast. Parents weren't thrilled either. At $179, this wasn't an impulse buy. And when their kids used it once or twice and then forgot about it, that stung. Fisher-Price pulled the PXL 2000 from stores after just 1 year. It was a commercial disaster. But here's the twist. Years later, indie filmmakers discovered the PXL 2000. They loved its weird, gritty aesthetic. Artists started using it to create experimental films. It became a cult favorite in underground film circles. So the PXL 2000 found its audience eventually. Just not the one Fisher-Price had in mind. And definitely not in time to save the product from being a massive flop. Number 8. Reebok Pump. Now, you might be thinking, wait, didn't the Reebok Pump do well? And you'd be partially right. But stick with me here. Reebok launched the Pump in 1989. These were basketball shoes with a built-in inflation system. You'd press this little basketball on the tongue, and air would pump into the shoe, giving you a custom fit. The technology was genuinely innovative. Athletes loved the idea of a shoe that could adjust to their foot. And when D. Brown wore them during the 1991 NBA Slam Dunk contest, pumping them up before his winning dunk, the shoes became iconic. For a brief moment, Reebok was on top of the world. The Pump was everywhere. Kids begged their parents for a pair. The shoes were selling like crazy. But then the problem started. First, they were expensive. Really expensive. We're talking $170 in 1989 dollars. That's over $400 in today's money. For sneakers. Second, the pump mechanism didn't actually improve performance. It was cool, sure, but it didn't make you jump higher or run faster. It was basically a gimmick. Third, and most importantly, Nike wasn't about to let Reebok steal their thunder. While Reebok was focused on pump technology, Nike was signing Michael Jordan and building an empire around actual athletic performance. The pump's popularity faded fast. By the mid-90s, they were seen as overpriced relics from a bygone era. Reebok tried to keep the line going, but they never recaptured that initial magic. The company's market share plummeted. They went from being neck and neck with Nike to a distant second, and eventually they got bought out by Adidas. The pump wasn't a complete failure, but it represents a bigger failure. Reebok's inability to compete with Nike's focus on performance and athlete endorsements. They bet on gimmicks instead of substance, and it cost them the game. Number 7. Next computer. Let's talk about Steve Jobs, but not the triumphant iPhone creating Steve Jobs. We're talking about the Steve Jobs who got fired from Apple and decided to show them what they were missing. In 1988, Jobs launched Next Computer. This was supposed to be the future of computing, a sleek, powerful workstation for universities and businesses. And honestly, the Next Computer was impressive. It had a beautiful design. The operating system, Next Step, was years ahead of its time. It had features that wouldn't become standard until decades later. But there was one tiny problem. It cost $6,500. That's over $16,000 in today's money. For a computer. Universities, the target market, took one look at that price tag and said, no thanks. They could buy multiple PCs or Macs for the same price. The software library was almost non-existent. Developers didn't want to create programs for a platform that hardly anyone owned. And the hardware, while innovative, had some weird choices, like a magneto-optical drive instead of a floppy disk drive. Sure, it could store more data, but nobody else used magneto-optical disks, so sharing files was a nightmare. Sales were abysmal. Next sold maybe 50,000 computers total over several years. That's nothing. Apple was selling millions. Jobs tried pivoting to software, but that didn't save the company either. Next was bleeding money. The irony? When Apple bought Next in 1997, bringing Jobs back to the company, Next Step became the foundation for Mac OS X. The operating system that failed in the 90s became the basis for Apple's modern success. But as a product in the 1990s, the Next computer was an expensive flop that nearly bankrupted its creator. Number 6. WebTV. Imagine this. It's 1996. You want to browse the internet, but you don't want to buy a computer. They're expensive, complicated, and take up space. Enter WebTV. This little set-top box promised to bring the internet to your television. Just plug it in, connect it to your phone line, and boom. You're surfing the web from your couch. Microsoft loved this idea so much, they bought the company for $425 million. On paper, WebTV made perfect sense. Millions of Americans had TVs, but not computers. This could bring the internet to the masses. In reality, it was a disaster. First, the internet in 1996 ran on dial-up. Slow, painful dial-up. Loading a single web page could take minutes. Now imagine doing that on a TV screen from across the room. Second, websites weren't designed for TVS. Text was too small to read. Navigation was clunky. You had to use this wireless keyboard that never worked quite right. Third, the experience was just frustrating. Typing URLs with a remote control or a finicky keyboard. Waiting forever for pages to load. Squinting at tiny text. People who wanted the internet badly enough just bought computers. People who didn't want it that badly weren't going to suffer through WebTV. Microsoft kept trying to make it work. They rebranded it as MSN TV. They updated the hardware. They lowered the price. Nothing helped. WebTV never gained traction. It became a punchline, a symbol of trying to force two technologies together that just didn't fit. By the time broadband internet became common, the whole concept was obsolete anyway. Why use a clunky set-top box when you could get a laptop? WebTV shut down for good in 2013, but it had been dead for years before that. Microsoft's $425 million investment turned into one of their most embarrassing failures of the decade. Number 5. Commodore CDTV. Let's rewind to 1991. CDs are the hot new thing. CD players are in every home, and Commodore thinks, what if we made a CD player that's also a computer? Thus was born the Commodore CDTV. It looked like a stereo component. It could play audio CDs, but it was also a full computer based on the Amiga platform, capable of running games and multimedia software. Commodore was convinced this was the future, a living room entertainment system that could do everything. The problem? Nobody knew what it was supposed to be. Was it a game console? Kind of, but it cost $999. The Super Nintendo was $199. Was it a computer? Sort of, but it didn't come with a keyboard or mouse. You had to buy those separately. Was it a CD player? Sure, but you could get a regular CD player for a fraction of the price. The marketing was all over the place. Commodore couldn't decide who they were selling to. Gamers? Families? Tech enthusiasts? Everyone? And the software library was pathetic. There just weren't many titles designed specifically for the CDTV. You could run some Amiga games, but the experience was awkward without proper controls. Retailers didn't know where to put it. Was it in the computer section? The stereo section? The toy section? Customers were equally confused. When they asked what it did, salespeople couldn't give a clear answer. The CDTV sold terribly. Commodore discontinued it after just 2 years. They tried replacing it with the Amiga CD32, but that failed too. The whole debacle was a symptom of Commodore's bigger problems. The company was losing its way, making products nobody wanted, and burning through cash. By 1994, Commodore was bankrupt. The CDTV wasn't the only reason, but it was a perfect example of how out of touch the company had become. Number 4. Iomega Jaz Drive. Remember when we talked about the zip drive? Well, Iomega decided to make a bigger, better version. That was a mistake. In 1996, Iomega launched the Jaz Drive. This was a removable storage system that could hold up to 2 gigabytes per cartridge. That was huge for the time. The Jaz Drive was aimed at professionals, graphic designers, video editors, anyone who needed to move large files around. And at first, it seemed promising. The capacity was impressive. The speed was decent. Professionals were interested. But then the problems started piling up. First, it was expensive. The drive itself cost around $600. Each cartridge was $125. If you needed multiple cartridges for backup or different projects, you were looking at serious money. Second, it inherited all of Iomega's reliability problems. Remember the click of death from the zip drive? The Jaz Drive had its own issues. Cartridges would fail. Data would get corrupted. Drives would stop working. Third, Iomega's customer service was notoriously terrible. They charged $19.99 just to call their support line. People were furious. There were lawsuits. Fourth, and this is the killer, CDR drives were getting cheaper and better. By the late 90s, you could burn CDs for pennies each. They held 650 megabytes, which was enough for most people, and they were way more reliable. The Jaz Drive never caught on. Sales were disappointing. The product line limped along for a few years, but it was clear Iomega had missed the mark. The company's reputation was in tatters. Between the zip drive failures and the Jaz Drive disappointment, nobody trusted Iomega anymore. The Jaz Drive was discontinued in 2002. By then, USB flash drives and external hard drives were taking over. Removable cartridge systems were dead. Iomega never recovered. They got bought out and eventually disappeared. The Jaz Drive was one of the final nails in their coffin. Number 3. Sony MiniDisc. Sony was on top of the world in the early 90s. The Walkman had made them kings of portable music. So when they introduced the MiniDisc in 1992, everyone paid attention. The MiniDisc was supposed to be the next evolution. It was smaller than a CD, but could hold 74 minutes of music. It was recordable and rewritable. The discs were protected in a hard shell, so they wouldn't scratch like CDs. Sony poured massive resources into this format. They made players, recorders, home stereos, car stereos. They were all in, and for a while, it looked like it might work. In Japan, MiniDisc became pretty popular. People liked the convenience and the sound quality. But in America, it was a different story. First, the players were expensive. We're talking $400 to $500 for a decent portable player. You could buy a CD player for $50. Second, pre-recorded minidiscs were hard to find. Record stores didn't stock many titles. If you wanted music on minidisc, you had to record it yourself from CDs. Third, the recording process was a pain. You had to play the CD in real time while recording to the minidisc. A 60-minute album took 60 minutes to transfer, and you had to manually enter all the track information. Fourth, and this is the big one, MP3 players were coming. By the late 90s, people were discovering they could rip CDs to their computers and carry hundreds of songs on a portable device. When Apple launched the iPod in 2001, it was game over. The iPod could hold 1,000 songs. It was easy to use. It looked cool. And iTunes made managing your music library simple. MiniDisc couldn't compete. Sony had bet on the wrong format. They'd invested billions in a technology that was obsolete before it even had a chance to succeed. Sony finally gave up on MiniDisc in the late 2000s. But by then, they'd lost their dominance in portable music. The iPod had won. The MiniDisc wasn't a bad product. It was actually pretty good. But it was the wrong product at the wrong time, and Sony's stubbornness in pushing it cost them dearly. Number 2. Apple Pippin. We've already talked about one Apple failure from the 90s, but they had another one that was even worse. In 1996, Apple decided to get into the gaming console market. Their solution? The Apple Pippin. This was a weird hybrid device. It could play games, browse the internet, and run educational software. It was based on Apple's PowerPC technology and ran a stripped-down version of Mac OS. Apple partnered with Bandai, the Japanese toy company, to manufacture and sell it. The idea was that Bandai's gaming expertise would help Apple break into the console market. The Pippin launched in Japan in 1996 and in the US in 1997. It cost $599. That price alone should tell you how this story ends. The Sony PlayStation, which had launched a year earlier, cost $299. The Nintendo 64 was $199. Both had massive game libraries and strong developer support. The Pippin had neither. There were maybe 18 games total for the system. Most of them were educational titles or weird experiments. Nothing that would make you want to spend $599. The hardware was already outdated when it launched. The specs were mediocre compared to the competition. And the controller was this bizarre trackball thing that nobody liked. Apple's marketing was non-existent. Most people didn't even know the Pippin existed. Those who did know about it couldn't figure out why they'd want one. The internet features were pointless. This was 1996. Most people didn't have internet at home. And if they did, they weren't going to browse the web on their TV with a game controller. The Pippin was a catastrophic failure. It sold fewer than 50,000 units worldwide. That's not a typo. Fewer than 50,000. Apple and Bandai pulled the plug quickly. The whole experiment was over by 1997. The Pippin represents everything wrong with Apple in the mid-90s. They were unfocused, making products nobody wanted, and charging premium prices for mediocre hardware. It's no wonder Steve Jobs cleaned house when he came back to Apple later that year. The company was a mess. Number 1. Nintendo Virtual Boy. And now we've reached the biggest tech flop of the 1990s, the one that still makes people's eyes hurt just thinking about it. In 1995, Nintendo released the Virtual Boy. This was supposed to be the future of gaming. True 3D graphics, immersive virtual reality, a revolutionary experience. What we got instead was a red and black nightmare that gave people headaches. Let's start with the design. The Virtual Boy wasn't portable, despite being marketed as a portable system. You had to set it on a table and lean over it, pressing your face into the eyepiece like you were looking through a microscope. This meant you couldn't play it lying down. You couldn't play it on the go. You had to sit at a table, hunched over, for however long you could stand it. And you couldn't stand it for long. The display was entirely red and black. No other colors, just red. Bright, eye-searing red. Nintendo claimed this was a technical limitation, but it made every game look like you were playing inside a volcano. The 3D effect was supposed to be amazing. In reality, it gave people headaches, eye strain, and motion sickness. Nintendo even included warnings about taking breaks every 15 minutes. Imagine that. A game console that comes with a warning to stop playing it. The game library was pathetic. Only 22 games were ever released. most of them were forgettable. The best game, Mario Tennis, was just okay. Parents hated it. Reports of kids getting sick or complaining about headaches made them nervous. Nobody wanted to buy their child a toy that came with health warnings. The price didn't help. At $180, it was expensive for what you got. Especially when the Game Boy, which actually was portable and had hundreds of games, cost less. Nintendo pulled the Virtual Boy from stores after just 1 year. They sold about 770,000 units total. For Nintendo, that was a disaster. The company took a huge financial hit, but worse than the money was the damage to their reputation. Nintendo was supposed to be the king of gaming. The Virtual Boy made them look out of touch and reckless. It took years for Nintendo to recover. They had to rebuild trust with the Nintendo 64 and later the Game Boy Advance. The Virtual Boy is still considered one of the worst consoles ever made. It's a cautionary tale about rushing technology to market before it's ready, about ignoring user experience in favor of gimmicks, about letting ambition override common sense. Nintendo learned from this failure. But man, did they learn it the hard way. So there you have it. 10 innovative products from the 1990s that failed terribly. From Apple's embarrassments to Nintendo's nightmare, these products prove that even the biggest companies can get it spectacularly wrong. What's the lesson here? Innovation is risky. Sometimes you swing for the fences and strike out. Sometimes you create something technically impressive that nobody wants. And sometimes you make a product that literally makes people sick. But here's the thing. Failure teaches us more than success. These flops shaped the tech industry. They taught companies what not to do. They showed us that price matters, that user experience matters, and that being first doesn't always mean being best. The companies that survived these failures learned and adapted. Apple came back stronger. Nintendo bounced back. Even Sony recovered from the MiniDisc disaster. The ones that didn't learn? Well, they're not around anymore. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane and want to see more tech history deep dives, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment and let us know which 90s tech flop you remember most. And if you lived through any of these disasters, we want to hear your stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.